The comments started before I'd even finished unloading my gear from the canoe. Bill Hendricks, a Michigan man who'd been working the 40-mile river diggings for 2 seasons, watched me unfold the canvas wedge tent and let out a low whistle that wasn't meant as a compliment. "That's what you're planning to winter in?" he called across the gravel bar. "Looks like a grave marker, more than a shelter." The other men working their sluice boxes looked up. A few laughed. One of them, a thick-shouldered Swede whose name I hadn't learned yet, shook his head and went back to shoveling gravel. The judgment was instant and universal. My tent was wrong. I didn't blame them for thinking so. Standing next to their wall tents, mine looked like something that had been starved. Their structures rose 7 feet at the peak, with vertical walls that created spacious interiors 10 feet square. Mine measured barely 4 feet wide at the base, tapering to a ridgepole that ran lengthwise, creating a shelter that looked more like a collapsed sail than proper housing. The canvas was heavy duck, 12-ounce weight, but the shape made it appear flimsy, inadequate. The kind of shelter a man would choose if he didn't understand what winter meant this far north. I'd arrived at the 40-mile camp in the 3rd week of September 1891. The aspens along the river were already turning gold, and the morning air carried that particular bite that told you winter wasn't coming soon. It was already on its way. Most of the prospectors had been here since spring, working the creek gravels, building their winter quarters during the brief summer months when the ground wasn't frozen solid. They'd done everything according to accepted frontier wisdom: large tents for living space, vertical walls to maximize interior volume, sheet metal stoves positioned against back walls with straight pipes running up through the canvas. The standard approach that had worked for trappers and miners across the northern territories for decades. My tent violated every one of those principles, and the men made sure I knew it. "You'll freeze in that thing," Hendricks said that evening when he stopped by my camp. He wasn't being cruel, just stating what seemed like an obvious fact. A man needs room in winter, room to move around, room to store gear, room to keep from going crazy when you're stuck inside for days at a stretch. I was digging at the time, clearing the footprint where my tent would sit. Not just clearing brush and rocks, but actually excavating the ground. Hendricks watched me work the shovel, his expression moving from curiosity to confusion. "What are you doing?" "Digging," I said. "I can see that. What I mean is, why?" I kept working, measuring the depth with a stick I'd marked at 18-inch intervals. The ground here wasn't frozen yet, though it would be soon enough. The top layer was loose river gravel mixed with organic soil, easy to move. Below that, the digging got harder, but I kept at it. "Cold air settles," I finally said. "Sinks to the lowest point it can find. If the lowest point is below where you're sleeping, the cold pool's there instead of where you're lying." Hendricks considered this. I could see him trying to work through the logic, deciding whether it made sense or whether I was just justifying strange behavior. After a moment, he shrugged. "Maybe so, but you're still going to freeze in a tent that narrow. Wind'll cut right through it, and you won't have room for a proper stove." He meant well. Most of them did. They weren't trying to be cruel or drive me away. They were genuinely concerned that I'd made a mistake, that I'd bought the wrong equipment for the environment, and that I'd pay for that mistake when the real cold arrived. Their concern was based on experience, the experience of men who'd survived winters in these tents, in this valley, using methods that had worked. Who was I to show up with different ideas? I was nobody. Special. 28 years old, born in Wisconsin to Norwegian immigrants, worked as a carpenter's helper in Duluth before the lure of gold pulled me north. I'd filed no claims yet, had no reputation in the camp, owned nothing but the gear in my canoe and the knowledge my uncle had beaten into me during 3 winters in the Hardangervidda plateau of Norway. That knowledge was worth more than they knew, but I couldn't explain it in a way they'd understand. Not yet. So I kept digging. By the time I'd excavated the full footprint, 7 feet long, 4 feet wide, 18 inches deep, word had spread through the camp. Men found excuses to walk past my site. Some stopped to ask questions. Others just looked and shook their heads. A few offered advice, suggestions for how I should modify my plans, warnings about what wouldn't work. Thomas Riley, an Irishman who'd prospected in Nevada before coming north, was the most direct. "You're building a grave, lad," he said, standing at the edge of my excavation. "That's what that looks like, a grave with a tent for a headstone." "Graves are usually deeper," I said. "Give it time. You'll be digging deeper once winter teaches you different." I didn't argue. Arguments required convincing people before the fact, and I'd learned that was nearly impossible. Experience was the only teacher that really changed minds, and experience took time. So I smiled, nodded, and went back to work. The next phase drew even more attention. I hauled stones from the creek bed, flat river rocks worn smooth by water, each one roughly the size of my two hands cupped together. I lined the bottom of my excavation with these stones, fitting them together as tightly as possible, creating a floor that would conduct heat away more slowly than bare earth. The men watched this with mounting skepticism. "He's building a root cellar," someone said, "or a smokehouse. Whatever it is, it ain't a tent." But it was a tent. I raised it on the third day, stretching. The canvas over a frame I'd built from spruce poles cut from the forest edge. The ridge pole ran the length of the excavation, supported at each end by vertical poles and in the middle by a slightly shorter support that created the peaked roofline. The canvas pulled tight over this frame, staked to the ground at angles that created walls sloping at roughly 45 degrees from vertical. When it was finished, the tent stood just over 5 feet tall at the peak. A man my height, 5'9", could stand upright only in the center. The interior space was narrow enough that I could touch both walls while sitting in the middle. The entrance was a simple flap at one end, the canvas overlapping itself to create a seal against wind. It looked exactly like what Bill Hendricks had called it, a grave marker, long, narrow, low to the ground, nothing like the spacious wall tents that dotted the rest of the camp. "Well," Hendricks said, examining the finished structure, "at least you won't have far to fall when you collapse from cold." The others laughed. Not mean laughter, but the kind men share when they're watching someone make a mistake they've already learned to avoid. They'd all been greenhorns once. They'd all made errors. This was just another man learning the hard way. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that every angle, every measurement, every choice I'd made was deliberate. The narrow width reduced the volume of air that needed heating. The steep walls would shed snow instead of accumulating weight. The sunken floor would trap cold air below the sleeping level. The stone base would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. These weren't innovations. They were old principles, learned by people who'd lived in mountains where winter lasted 8 months and inadequate shelter meant death. My uncle Lars had built similar structures in Norway, not tents, permanent sod houses, but the physics were the same. Heat rises. Cold sinks. Steep angles deflect wind and shed snow. Mass stores thermal energy. The prospectors of the 40-mile camp knew some of these principles. They understood that you needed insulation, that you had to seal gaps against wind, that a good stove was essential. But they'd learned these lessons in milder conditions. The previous 5 winters in the Yukon had been cold, certainly, but not catastrophic. The kind of cold where a man could survive in a standard wall tent as long as he kept his fire going and didn't do anything stupid. They were building for the winters they'd experienced. I was building for the winters I'd seen in Norway, where my uncle's neighbor had frozen to death in a shelter that looked perfectly adequate from the outside. The difference between those two approaches wouldn't matter until it mattered absolutely. My uncle Lars Anderson lived in a stone house in the Hardangervidda, 17 miles from the nearest village, at an elevation where trees stopped growing and the wind never truly stopped. He worked as a shepherd, tending sheep through the brief mountain summers and maintaining trap lines through the winters. He was my mother's brother, and when I was 19 and restless in Wisconsin, she sent me to him with a letter that said I needed to learn what hard work meant. I spent 3 winters with Lars. 3 winters that taught me more about survival than any book or teacher could have conveyed. The house itself was a lesson in principles. Stone walls 3 feet thick at the base, rising to a turf roof that looked like an extension of the hillside. The entrance faced south, protected by an extension of the roof that created a covered area where snow couldn't drift against the door. Inside, the main room measured perhaps 12 feet square, with a massive stone fireplace that occupied the entire north wall, not built against it, but integrated into it so that the thermal mass of the fireplace became part of the structural wall. The first night I slept there, I understood why it was built that way. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero. Inside, with only a moderate fire burning, the room stayed warm enough that I could sit in my shirt sleeves. The stone walls absorbed the fire's heat and released it slowly, creating a stable temperature that lasted through the night even after the fire died down to coals. Stone remembers warmth, Lars told me that winter. Wood burns and the heat goes up the chimney, gone forever. Stone takes the heat, holds it, gives it back slowly. This is why our houses have thick walls. Not to keep cold out. Cold always finds a way in. The walls are there to store summer's warmth through winter. He spoke Norwegian, and my Norwegian was poor at first, but I learned quickly because understanding him meant understanding how to stay alive. He didn't tolerate stupidity or carelessness. When I made mistakes, and I made many, he didn't spare my feelings. He just explained what I'd done wrong and why it would have killed me if we'd been truly isolated. The most important lesson came during a storm in January of my second winter. We were checking trap lines in the high country when the weather changed without warning. Clear skies turned gray, then white. Wind rose from nothing to gale force in what felt like minutes. Temperature plummeted. Within an hour, we were in a full blizzard, visibility reduced to the length of my arm, wind so strong it was difficult to stand. Lars didn't panic. He adjusted his pack, checked his bearings using landmarks I couldn't see, and started walking. Not back toward the house, that was miles away, impossible to reach in these conditions. He walked toward a specific ridge, and when we reached it, he stopped at what looked like a random pile of stones. It wasn't random, it was a shelter he'd built years earlier, a simple structure half dug into the hillside, roofed with flat stones and turf. The entrance was barely wide enough to crawl through. Inside, the space was tiny, perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, the roof so low I couldn't sit upright. We stayed there for 3 days while the storm raged outside. That shelter, cramped and crude as it was, kept us alive. Not comfortable, we were cold, hungry, cramped, but alive. When the storm finally cleared and we made our way back to the main house, Lars took me back to that shelter one more time. "Look at it," he said. "What do you see?" I saw a hole in the ground with a roof, barely worthy of the name shelter. "Now tell me why you're alive." I thought about it. "Because we got out of the wind." "Yes, what else?" "Because it was small, less space to heat with our bodies." "Yes, what else?" I studied the structure more carefully. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind. The roof was steep enough. That snow had slid off rather than accumulating. The floor was slightly lower than the entrance, creating a cold trap. The walls were earth and stone, materials that held what little warmth our bodies generated. "It's built like your house," I finally said. "Just smaller, same principles?" Lars nodded. "Same principles. A shelter is not about size or comfort. It is about physics. Wind, cold, moisture. These are forces that follow rules. If you understand the rules, you can build structures that work with those forces instead of fighting them. This is what separates men who survive from men who die thinking they were prepared. He pointed at the steep roof. Snow slides off steep surfaces, accumulates on flat ones. Snow is heavy. Heavy things crush. Therefore, steep roofs. He pointed at the entrance. Wind comes from the northwest in winter. Door faces south. Wind cannot blow directly in. Therefore, we stay warmer. He pointed at the low roof. Heat rises. High ceilings mean heat stays high, away from people. Low ceilings mean heat stays where we are. Therefore, low roofs in winter. Each principle was simple. Together, they created structures that worked in conditions that killed people in seemingly adequate shelters. The third winter I spent with Lars, I helped him build a small summer shelter higher in the mountains, a place he could stay when tending sheep in the high pastures. We built it using the same principles as his main house, just smaller and simpler. Thick walls of stacked stone without mortar, turf roof on a steep angle, entrance facing south, floor slightly excavated, a small fireplace in the center rather than against a wall. "Why center?" I asked as we positioned the stones. "Because heat radiates in all directions from a fire," Lars said. "If the fire is against a wall, half that radiation is wasted warming the outside. If the fire is in the center, all the radiation stays inside. Also, the smoke draft works better. The heat rises from the center, pulling cold air in from all sides, creating circulation. Against a wall, you get dead air in the corners." We spent 2 weeks building that shelter. It measured 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than most garden sheds. When it was finished, Lars made me spend 3 nights there alone in late October, before the real cold set in, but after snow had already begun falling. Those 3 nights taught me more than the previous 2 winters combined. I learned how the morning sun hit the south-facing entrance and warmed the interior even when the outside air was below freezing. I learned how cold air pooled in the depressed floor area during the night, creating a layer I could feel when I dropped my hand toward the ground. I learned how the stone fireplace absorbed heat during the evening and radiated it back through the night, keeping the temperature remarkably stable even after the fire died. Most importantly, I learned that a well-designed small shelter was more effective than a poorly designed large one. The size didn't matter. The physics did. When I left Norway in the spring of my 3rd year, Lars gave me 2 things, a set of good tools and a warning. "You are going to cold places," he said. "People there will tell you how to build. Listen to them, but remember what you learned here. Different mountains, same physics, same rules. If you forget this, you will die, and I will be disappointed." I remembered. When I bought my tent in Seattle before heading north, I looked for one that matched the principles Lars had taught me. Most of the mining suppliers sold wall tents, large square affairs designed for comfort and space. I found a wedge tent instead, narrow and steep-sided, the kind used by military surveyors in mountain regions. The clerk tried to talk me out of it. "You want a wall tent," he insisted. "More room, better for winter." I bought the wedge tent. Cost me $3 less, which was good because money was tight, but I would have paid more. I knew what I needed. Standing in the Yukon camp, listening to men tell me I'd made a mistake, I thought about Lars and his shelter in the high country. I thought about the storm that had caught us and the cramped stone structure that had kept us alive. I thought about the physics that didn't care whether you believed in them or not. The men at 40 Mile were experienced prospectors. They'd survived winters here. They knew things I didn't know about mining, about creek claims, about the specific challenges of Yukon weather. Their advice came from genuine experience, and most of it was probably sound. But they hadn't survived winters in the Hardangervidda. They hadn't learned from a man who treated physics like religion and mistakes like sins. They were building for the conditions they knew, and those conditions had been relatively mild. I was building for the conditions Lars had taught me to expect, the kind that came without warning and tested everything you thought you knew about adequate preparation. The difference between us wouldn't matter until winter revealed which approach was correct. Until then, I was just the fool with the skinny tent, and they were the experienced men who knew better. The morning after I raised the tent, I began the work that would occupy most of October. While the other prospectors focused on their final gold recovery before freeze-up, I worked on modifications to my shelter that seemed, to anyone watching, either obsessive or paranoid. The first task was banking. I needed earth piled against the lower 2 feet of canvas on all sides, creating a thermal barrier between the interior and the outside air. Not just any earth, I needed material that would pack tight, shed water, and not freeze into a solid mass that would tear the canvas when it expanded. The ideal material was a mix of sandy soil and clay, something with enough clay content to bind together but enough sand to drain. I found it 50 yards from my tent, where the creek had deposited a layer of fine sediment during some previous flood. I hauled it in a canvas sack, one load at a time, building up the bank gradually. Bill Hendricks stopped by on the third day of this work. He watched me dump another load of soil against the tent wall and spread it with my hands, packing it firm. "You planning to bury yourself?" he asked. "Just the bottom 2 feet?" "Why?" "Wind," I said. "Wind hits a vertical surface. It creates pressure. Hits an angled surface, it deflects up and over. The bank creates a smooth transition from ground to canvas. Less pressure, less air infiltration." Hendricks crouched down and examined my work. The bank sloped gradually from ground level to where it met the canvas, creating a ramp rather than a sharp angle. I'd packed the soil tight, using stones as internal structure to prevent settling. "Huh," Hendricks said. "Never thought about wind pressure. Usually just worry about keeping the stakes from pulling out." "Stakes matter too," I said. "But most heat loss isn't from the tent blowing away. It's from air moving through gaps, through the weave of the canvas, through any place where cold outside air can exchange with warm inside air. The bank reduces that exchange at the ground level, where cold air naturally settles anyway." He watched me work for another few minutes, then nodded slowly. "You think about this stuff a lot." "Learned it from a man who'd die if he didn't think about it." After Hendricks left, I continued banking. The work took 6 days to complete properly. By the end, the lower portion of my tent looked like a permanent structure, earth bermed on 3 sides, only the entrance end left clear for access. The canvas rose from this earth bank at its characteristic steep angle, creating a shelter that was half tent, half earthwork. The next modification drew even more attention because it required me to work inside the tent, and the sounds of hammering and sawing carried across the camp. I was building a floor system, not a solid floor, that would trap cold air and moisture underneath, creating a permanently damp, cold space. Instead, I built a raised platform using thin spruce poles laid perpendicular to the tent's length, elevated 4 inches above the stone base on cross pieces. The function of this floor was threefold. First, it created an air gap between the stones and my sleeping area, providing insulation. Second, the gaps between the poles allowed air circulation, preventing moisture from my breath and body from accumulating underneath. Third, it gave me a flat, dry surface to sleep on that wouldn't conduct heat away as quickly as direct contact with stone. Thomas Riley, the Irishman, came by while I was lashing the poles together with spruce root twine I'd made by splitting and soaking the thin roots found near the surface of the forest floor. "That's a fair amount of work for a temporary camp," he said. "Who said it's temporary?" "You planning to stay all winter? Most of the boys head down river come November, spend winter in 40 Mile Town." "I'm staying." Riley looked at the floor platform, then at the banked earth outside, then back at me. "You really think that skinny tent of yours is going to handle a Yukon winter?" "Yes." "Well," he scratched his beard, "you've got confidence, I'll give you that. Hope it's justified." After the floor came the most critical modification, the stove installation. This was where most men made their biggest mistake, and where Lars's teaching became most valuable. I'd purchased a small sheet metal stove in Seattle, A simple box 18 inches square and 12 inches deep, with a firebox below and a flat cooking surface on top. It weighed perhaps 20 pounds and could be broken down into flat panels for transport. Most prospectors used similar stoves, mounted on legs against the back wall of their tents, with the stovepipe running straight up through a heat collar in the canvas. I positioned mine in the center of the tent. This required building a base that would protect the wooden floor platform from heat. I used flat stones from the creek, carefully selected for uniform thickness, mortared together with a mud mixture that would dry hard. The base measured 2 feet square, elevated 2 inches above the floor platform, creating a stable, fireproof surface. The stove sat on this base, positioned so that its door faced the entrance of the tent. This meant I could feed the fire without crawling around the stove, and it meant the primary radiation of heat, which came from the door when opened, would flow toward the sleeping area rather than toward a wall. The stovepipe was the technical challenge. Rather than running straight up from the stove through the canvas peak, I ran it at an angle. The pipe came out the back of the stove, then rose at roughly 30 degrees toward the ridgepole, where it passed through a double-layered heat collar I'd sewn into the canvas. Anders Lindstrom, the thick-shouldered Swede I'd noticed my first day, stopped by during this installation. He'd been watching my work from a distance for days but hadn't spoken to me directly. Now he stood at the tent entrance, studying the angled stovepipe with obvious interest. "Why not straight up?" he asked. His English was heavily accented but clear. "Exhaust heat," I said. "If the pipe runs straight up, the heat moves through it fast, exits fast, wasted. If it angles, the heat moves slower, more time to radiate into the tent. Also, longer pipe means more surface area for radiation." Lindstrom stepped fully into the tent without asking permission, moving carefully around the stove to examine the installation. He was a big man, and the narrow tent made him look even larger, but he moved with surprising delicacy. "How much slower?" he asked. "Don't know exactly, but I can hold my hand near the pipe here." I gestured to where the pipe rose from the stove, and here, I pointed to where it passed through the canvas, and feel the difference. More heat staying inside rather than going straight to the sky. "You learned this where?" "Norway." Lindstrom nodded slowly. "My grandfather," he said, "built like this in Sweden. Old. Way. People here say it doesn't matter, but my grandfather lived to 92. Warm every winter." He examined the rest of the tent's interior, the raised floor, the centered stove, the banked earth outside visible through the entrance flap. When he finished his inspection, he met my eyes directly. "Men here think you are foolish," he said. "They say your tent is too small, wrong shape. But I think maybe they have not seen cold like you, and I have seen cold." "Maybe," I said. "How cold does it get in Norway?" "Where I stayed, 40 below was common. 50 below happened. Once we saw 55 below." Lindstrom nodded. "Sweden, similar. Here they say it gets cold, but I have not seen worse than 20 below in 5 winters. Men think they know winter, but they know only this winter, these winters. Not the winter that can come." He stood to leave, pausing at the entrance. "If the cold comes like I remember from home, your tent will be good. Maybe only tent that is good. The others?" He shrugged. "We will see." After Lindstrom left, I continued working on details that no one else would notice. I sewed additional tie-downs into the canvas at stress points. I treated every seam with a mixture of beeswax and pine pitch to seal against air infiltration. I built a small vestibule at the entrance using a piece of spare canvas, creating a buffer zone where cold air would be trapped before entering the main tent. I cut and stacked firewood, but not the way the others did. They were building massive piles, enough to keep large stoves burning hot in spacious tents through long winter nights. I cut smaller pieces, more carefully sized, focused on slow-burning woods like birch and tamarack that would produce steady heat rather than quick flames. The work took all of October. By the end of the month, when the first serious snow fell, I'd built something that looked like a hybrid between a tent and a permanent structure. The other prospectors had finished their preparations weeks earlier and were focused on their final gold recovery before the ground froze completely. I'd recovered no gold. I'd spent the entire month working on shelter. By their economic calculation, I'd wasted valuable time. By Lars's calculation, I'd done the only thing that mattered. The difference between those two calculations would become clear when winter arrived in earnest. Until then, I was still just the strange Norwegian with the skinny tent, the one who did everything the hard way, the one who'd probably learn better by spring. If he survived to see spring. The first week of November brought temperatures that dropped below zero at night, but rose above freezing during the day. These temperature swings revealed problems in every tent in camp, including mine, but the problems were different depending on how each shelter was designed. In the standard wall tents, the morning warm-up was rapid but uneven. The sun hit the canvas, heat built up quickly in the upper portions of the tent, while the floor level remained cold. Men woke sweating from the trapped heat near the ceiling, but kept their boots on because the floor was freezing. By evening, when the sun dropped and temperatures plummeted, that accumulated heat vanished fast. The canvas walls provided minimal insulation, and the large volume of interior air had to be reheated from near zero every night. My tent behaved differently, and it took me several days to understand why. The morning sun hit the south-facing entrance just after dawn. Because the tent was oriented lengthwise east-west, with the entrance at the west end, the morning light penetrated deep into the interior. The steep canvas walls, positioned at 45 degrees, caught this light at an optimal angle. The heat from the sun warmed the canvas, which in turn warmed the air inside, but the effect was more subtle than in the wall tents because my interior volume was smaller. More significantly, the stone base I'd laid in the excavated floor absorbed the morning solar heat. Stone is dense, has high thermal mass, takes time to warm, but also takes time to cool. Through the day, those creek stones at the bottom of my tent slowly absorbed heat energy. At night, when the air temperature dropped, those stones released that stored heat gradually. The effect wasn't dramatic. My tent didn't stay warm without a fire any more than the wall tents did. But the temperature swing was less severe. Where the wall tents might go from 50 degrees at midday to 10 degrees overnight, my tent ranged from 40 to 20. The difference, 10 degrees at the low end, was the difference between sleeping through the night and waking every few hours to feed the fire. I didn't fully understand this at first. I just noticed that I was sleeping better than expected and burning less wood than I'd calculated I would need. The understanding came during a conversation with Anders Lindström. He'd made a habit of stopping by my tent every few days, usually in the evening when work had finished. He'd ask questions about specific design choices, then share observations from his own experience. He was the only man in camp who treated my tent as something worth studying rather than a curiosity. One evening in mid-November, as we sat outside by a small fire, he asked about my wood consumption. "How much are you burning?" he said. "Per night." I'd been tracking this. "About a quarter cord per week, maybe a little less." Lindström looked surprised. "That is very little. I burn half a cord per week, and my tent is only slightly larger than yours." "Different stove placement," I said, "and the stone floor." "Explain the stone." I thought about how Lars would have explained it. Simple words, clear logic, based on observable phenomena. "Heat is energy," I said. "Fire releases energy by burning wood. That energy moves away from the fire in 3 ways. First, radiation, the heat you feel when you hold your hands near the fire. Second, conduction, heat moving through solid materials. Third, convection, hot air rising, cold air sinking." Lindström nodded. "Yes, these things I know." "In a normal tent," I continued, "most heat leaves by convection. Hot air rises to the top of the tent, escapes through gaps in the canvas or through the stovepipe. New cold air comes in at ground level to replace it. The fire burns constantly just to maintain temperature because the heat keeps leaving. This is why we burn so much wood, Lindstrom said. Yes, but if you can store some of the heat, capture it in mass that holds it, then that stored heat radiates back when the fire is low or out. The stone does this. During the day, sun heats the stone. During the evening, fire heats the stone. All night, the stone releases that stored heat slowly, not enough to keep the tent warm by itself, but enough to reduce how much wood I need to burn. Lindstrom was quiet for a moment, processing this. The stone is like a bank, he finally said. You deposit heat during the day, withdraw it at night. Exactly. And the centered stove? This also helps? Yes, because the heat radiates in all directions from a centered fire. In a standard setup with the stove against the wall, half the radiation goes to the exterior, wasted. Also, the convection pattern is different. Centered stove creates circular air movement. Hot air rises from the center, flows outward toward the walls, cools, sinks, flows back to the center. Continuous circulation. Against a wall, you get dead air in corners, cold spots. Lindstrom stood and walked to the entrance of my tent, looking at the stove placement inside. This makes sense, he said, but most men, they want space. They want to move around, store equipment. Centered stove takes space. Trade-off, I said. Space versus efficiency. In extreme cold, efficiency matters more than space. He turned back to me. You expect extreme cold. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. Why? The last 5 winters here, not so bad. Cold, yes, but survivable. Why do you expect worse? I thought about how to answer this. Lars would have said something about preparing for the worst rather than the average, about the difference between the worst weather that has happened and the worst weather that could happen. But Lindstrom deserved a more direct answer. Because patterns change, I said. My uncle in Norway told me about the winter of 1867, 20 years of mild winters before that. Everyone built lighter, cheaper. Then 1867 came, and it was worse than anything in living memory. People died in shelters that had worked fine for 2 decades. Not because they were careless, but because they'd built for the average instead of the possible. And you think this can happen here? I think it's foolish to assume it can't. Lindstrom nodded slowly. In Sweden we have a saying, hope for the best, build for the worst. Most people hope for the best. Forget the second part. Over the next week, I noticed Lindstrom making modifications to his own tent. He didn't dig it in or rebuild it completely. Too much work this late in the season. But he added banking around the base and repositioned some of his interior arrangements. He didn't announce what he was doing or ask for my advice. He just quietly made changes based on our conversation. 2 other men also made small modifications. One added extra tie-downs after observing how I'd reinforced my tent's stress points. Another improved his stovepipe installation, angling it slightly rather than running it straight up. These changes happened quietly, without fanfare or acknowledgement. Men didn't want to admit they were copying ideas from the foolish newcomer with the skinny tent. But they were pragmatic enough to recognize logic when they heard it, even if they didn't want to validate the source publicly. By late November, my tent had proven itself adequate for the conditions we'd experienced so far. The temperature had dropped as low as 15 below zero, which tested every shelter in camp but didn't exceed the capacity of any well-maintained tent with a good stove. I stayed warm, slept through most nights, and burned notably less wood than my neighbors. But I wasn't satisfied. 15 below was nothing. 20 below was manageable. Even 30 below would be cold but survivable in most of the camp's tents, as long as men stayed diligent about maintaining their fires and their shelters. I was preparing for something worse. Lars had taught me to build not for the worst I'd seen, but for the worst I could imagine. In the Hardangervidda, That meant building for 50 below with high winds. Here in the Yukon, I didn't know what the worst case looked like, but I knew the valley's geography suggested it could be severe. The 40-mile river valley ran roughly east-west, open at both ends with mountains rising on both sides. This created a natural wind tunnel. If a strong weather system moved through, the winds could accelerate through the valley, potentially reaching speeds that would test every structure. The steep walls of my tent were designed to deflect wind rather than resist it. The narrow profile meant less surface area for wind to push against. The banked earth prevented wind from getting underneath the canvas edge and creating lift. Every stake, every guy line, every reinforcement was positioned to handle forces exceeding anything I'd experienced in Norway. These preparations looked excessive in November. The weather had been cold but not catastrophic, windy but not destructive. To the other prospectors, my elaborate setup was overkill, the work of someone who didn't trust the local experience, who was building for problems that didn't exist. Lars would have approved completely. The temperature dropped to 20 below on November 28th. I woke before dawn, as I usually did, and knew immediately that something had changed. The air had a particular quality, a density that came with deep cold. My breath hung visible in the darkness, thick and white, and when I lit my candle, the flame burned steady and tall, no drafts, no air movement, meaning the tent was sealed tight against infiltration. I fed the stove before doing anything else. This was routine that had become automatic over the past weeks. 3 pieces of birch, arranged to allow airflow, lit with kindling I'd prepared the night before. The fire caught quickly, and within minutes the stove was radiating steady heat. The interior of the tent showed the effects of the temperature drop. Frost had formed on the canvas walls wherever my breath had condensed during the night, creating delicate patterns that caught the candlelight. This was normal, expected, and actually desirable. It meant moisture was leaving my body and the air rather than soaking into my bedding or clothing. What wasn't normal was the extent of the frost. It covered not just the upper portions of the canvas near the peak, where warm air accumulated, but extended down to within 2 feet of the floor level. This indicated that the temperature outside was low enough that even the lower portions of the tent were cold enough for condensation to freeze immediately on contact. I dressed fully before leaving the tent: wool, long underwear, wool pants, wool shirt, wool sweater, canvas outer jacket. In 20 below, exposed skin freezes in minutes, and moving between the heated tent and the outside air created a temperature differential of 60 degrees or more. The shock of that transition could be dangerous if you weren't prepared. Outside, the camp was just beginning to stir. Smoke rose from most tents, straight vertical columns in the still air. The lack of wind was actually more concerning than cold alone. Still air, at 20 below, was manageable. The combination of cold and wind was what killed people. I checked the exterior of my tent systematically. The earth banking showed no signs of frost heave or cracking. The canvas remained taut, no sagging or stress points. The guy lines were secure, stakes solid in the ground, though the ground itself was now frozen hard enough that pulling a stake would require a pickaxe. Bill Hendricks emerged from his tent as I was completing my inspection. He looked haggard, eyes red from smoke or lack of sleep. His tent was twice the size of mine, and I knew from previous conversations that he was burning through nearly a cord of wood per week, keeping it warm. "Christ, it's cold," he said by way of greeting. 20 below, I said. "Maybe a bit more." "How do you know?" "The way the air feels, how fast frost forms. Experience." Hendricks looked at my tent, then back at his. "How much wood did you burn last night?" "Maybe 3 pieces every 4 hours, so 12. Pieces total. Call it half a day's cutting." I went through nearly twice that, and my tent wasn't as warm as I'd like. I didn't say anything. The reasons for the difference were obvious to me. but explaining them would sound like criticism of his setup, and Hendricks was a decent man who didn't deserve that. "Your tent really working out then?" he asked. "So far." "Huh." He studied my tent more carefully, taking in details he'd dismissed before. "That banking really make that much difference?" "It helps. Reduces air infiltration where the canvas meets the ground. Also provides insulation. Earth is better than air at blocking heat transfer." "And the centered stove?" "More efficient. Heat radiates in all directions instead of half being wasted to the exterior." Hendricks was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe I was wrong," he said, "about your setup being inadequate. Seems like it's working better than mine, at least for efficiency." This was as close to an apology as frontier men usually got. I appreciated the honesty. "Different trade-offs," I said. "You have more space, which matters if you're storing equipment or need to move around. I have better efficiency, which matters in extended cold. Neither approach is wrong, just optimized for different priorities." "Still," Hendricks said, "if this cold keeps up, I'm going to make some changes. That banking especially. Seems like a good idea no matter what size tent you have." Over the next 3 days, the temperature remained below 20. This was the first extended cold snap of the season, and it revealed problems in several tents that hadn't been apparent during the brief cold snaps of early November. Thomas Riley's tent developed a gap where the canvas had shrunk in the cold, pulling away from the ground stake on the north side. Cold air poured through this gap, and no amount of stove heat could compensate. He spent half a day restaking and adding rocks to hold the canvas edge down, work that would have been easier if done before the ground froze solid. Another prospector, a young Scotsman named McGregor, discovered that his stovepipe connection had separated slightly, allowing smoke to leak into his tent. He had to dismantle the pipe in 20 below temperature, reseal the joints with mud paste, and reassemble everything while trying not to freeze his hands. The work took hours, and when he finally got his stove going again, his hands were white with frostbite that would bother him for the rest of the winter. My tent had problems too, but they were minor. The frost that formed on the interior canvas was heavier than expected, and when it melted slightly during the midday warming, water would drip onto my bedding. I solved this by wiping the frost down each morning before it could melt, collecting it in a pot that I'd melt for drinking water anyway. The ventilation flaps I'd cut near the peak also needed adjustment. I'd made them assuming they'd be opened only slightly in cold weather, but at 20 below, even the small amount of heat loss from partially open flaps was significant. I modified them so they could be closed completely while still allowing a tiny gap for air exchange, enough to prevent suffocation and reduce moisture buildup, but not so much that valuable heat escaped. Anders Lindstrom stopped by on the third evening of the cold snap. By now, this had become routine. He'd finish his own evening work and walk over to my tent, and we'd talk about cold weather survival while sitting by a small fire outside. The conversations were always practical, focused on specific techniques and observable results rather than theory or speculation. 20 below is not so bad, Lindstrom said that evening. Sweden, we see 30, 40 below regularly. But here, I notice something different. What's that? The dryness. In Sweden, cold but often with humidity from the ocean. Here, the air is dry, very dry. This changes things. He was right. The Yukon's interior location meant extremely low humidity in winter. This affected everything from how quickly wood burned, to how skin cracked, to how frost formed. The dryness was both blessing and curse. It made the cold feel less penetrating because dry air conducts heat more slowly than moist air, but it also meant exposed skin dehydrated quickly, and breathing the air dried out lungs and nasal passages. The dryness helps with some things, I said. Canvas doesn't absorb as much moisture, so it stays lighter, doesn't freeze as stiff. But you have to drink more water than you'd expect because the air pulls moisture from your body with every breath. Yes, I learned this. First winter here, I didn't drink enough, got headaches, thought I was sick, was just dehydrated. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. The cold pressed in from all sides, but the fire's radiant heat created a small zone of comfort. This was one of the paradoxes of cold weather. You could be comfortable in 20 below temperature as long as you had a heat source and protection from wind, but step away from that heat source and the cold became dangerous within minutes. "Do you think colder is coming?" Lindstrom finally asked. "Then this?" "Yes." "How much colder?" "Don't know, but this valley geography," I gestured at the mountains rising on both sides, "suggests winds could be severe if the right weather system comes through. Cold plus wind is worse than cold alone." "Much worse," Lindstrom agreed. "Wind chill. Wind finds every gap, every weakness. Still air, you can trap it, warm it. Moving air, impossible." "That's why the steep walls," I said, pointing at my tent. "Wind hits a steep surface, deflects up and over. Hits a vertical surface, creates pressure against it. In high wind, vertical walls are a liability." Lindstrom studied my tent's profile in the firelight. "Your tent looks like a blade," he said, "cutting through the wind rather than resisting it. That's the idea. And if the wind is very strong, stronger than you've seen before, then we find out if I built it right." The cold snap broke on the fourth day, temperature rising back to 0, then above freezing by midday. This was the pattern I'd observed so far, periods of cold alternating with periods of relative warmth, never sustaining extreme conditions long enough to truly test the limits of our shelters. But I noticed something in that pattern that concerned me. Each cold period was slightly longer and slightly colder than the previous one. The first cold snap in early November had lasted 1 day and reached 10 below. The second lasted 2 days and reached 15 below. This most recent one lasted 3 days and reached 20 below. If the pattern continued, and patterns in weather often did, the next cold snap would last 4 or more days and reach temperatures below 25. And eventually, winter would settle in for real. Not just cold snaps, but sustained cold that lasted weeks or months. When that happened, every weakness in every shelter would be revealed. The men who'd built adequately for moderate cold would discover whether adequate was enough. The men who'd built excessively, the ones like me who'd been mocked for overthinking and overbuilding, would discover whether their excessive preparation was justified or just wasted effort. I was confident in my tent's ability to handle deep cold without wind. I'd built it based on principles proven in Norway, using techniques Lars had taught me, optimized for thermal efficiency in extreme conditions. 20 below had tested it, and it had performed better than expected. But cold wasn't the only threat. Wind was coming. I could feel it in the way the weather patterns were developing, in the increasing volatility of the temperature swings, in the behavior of the animals that were now holing up for longer periods between foraging trips. When the wind came, everything would change. December arrived with clear skies and temperatures that swung wildly between 10 above and 15 below. The temperature instability kept everyone on edge. We'd have 2 days of relatively mild weather where the sun felt warm on south-facing surfaces, followed by a sudden drop that caught men unprepared. Wet clothing from daytime sweating would freeze on their bodies. Wood they'd thought was dry would burn poorly. Water left in buckets would split the metal when it froze solid. I noticed the changes in other men's camps during this period. Small modifications, done quietly, without announcement or explanation. Bill Hendricks spent 2 days banking earth around the base of his wall tent, using the same gradual slope technique I'd employed. He didn't ask for advice, but I saw him studying my tent's banking before starting his own work. Thomas Riley repositioned his stove. Not to the center, his tent was too large for that to be practical, but he moved it away from the back wall, creating an air gap that allowed heat to radiate in more directions. The difference was subtle, but I knew from his reduced wood consumption that it was working. The young Scotsman, McGregor, rebuilt his entire stovepipe installation, adding an angled section that increased the pipe length and surface area inside his tent. His hands were still bothering him from the frostbite, making the work difficult, but he persisted. When he finished, he came by my tent one evening. "Burned half as much wood last night," he said without preamble. "That angled pipe. You were right about it." "Your grandfather was right about it," I corrected. "I just learned from men who'd figured it out generations ago." "Well, whoever figured it out, it works." The most significant change came from Anders Lindstrom. He spent a week digging out the interior of his tent, excavating the floor 18 inches below the original ground level. This was brutal work. The ground was frozen now, requiring him to build fires to thaw each section before he could dig. He worked methodically, a few square feet per day, removing the softened earth and then starting new fires. I helped him on the 5th day, mostly by keeping fires going while he dug. We didn't talk much during the work, just focused on the task. When he finally finished and relaid his tent floor at the new level, he looked exhausted, but satisfied. "I should have done this in September," he said. "You didn't know in September. You knew." I knew what worked in Norway, didn't know for certain it would work here until I tried it. Lindstrom looked at his modified tent, then at mine. "Your uncle, the one in Norway, he must have been a good teacher." "He was a harsh teacher, made me redo things until they were right. Didn't tolerate carelessness or shortcuts. But yes, he was good." "This is the kind of teaching that keeps people alive," Lindstrom said. "Not soft teaching that makes you feel good, hard teaching that makes you capable." By mid-December, 7 of the camp's 15 tents had visible modifications based on principles I'd incorporated into my design. The men didn't acknowledge this directly. Frontier pride prevented that kind of admission, but the evidence was clear. They'd observed what worked, tested their own assumptions against those observations, and adjusted accordingly. This was how knowledge actually spread in isolated communities, not through formal instruction or written manuals, but through observation, quiet experimentation, and pragmatic adoption of techniques that proved superior. No one had to admit they'd been wrong. They just had to be smart enough to recognize better methods when they saw them working. The weather turned on December 18th. The morning started clear and cold around 10 below, but by noon, high clouds had moved in from the northwest. The barometric pressure began dropping, which I could feel in my joints and in the way smoke from fires began hanging lower instead of rising cleanly. Bill Hendricks noticed it too. He came by my tent that evening with a concerned expression. "Weather's changing," he said. "Yes. Feels like something big coming. Maybe." "You worried?" I thought about how to answer. Lars had taught me to respect weather, but not fear it. Fear made you panic, made you make mistakes. Respect made you prepare, and then trust your preparation. "I'm ready for whatever comes," I finally said. "If my tent fails, I built it wrong. If it holds, I built it right. Either way, I'll learn something." Hendricks nodded slowly. "That's a cold way of looking at it. It's a realistic way." He studied the sky where clouds were thickening. "If something bad comes, if things go wrong, my tent's bigger. There's room for others if needed." "Appreciated," I said. "Same here, though there's not much room." Any room is better than none when a man's freezing. This was the unspoken code of frontier communities. Men might mock each other, compete with each other, disagree with each other, but when survival was at stake, those conflicts disappeared. You helped whoever needed help, because next time it might be you needing help. The clouds continued building through the evening. By the time I went to sleep, the sky was completely overcast, and the temperature had risen slightly, up to 0. This warming during cloud cover was normal physics. Clouds trapped heat radiating from the ground, acting as insulation. But it also often meant precipitation was coming, and in December in the Yukon, precipitation meant snow. I slept lightly that night, waking several times to check the tent. Each time, everything seemed normal. The stove held its heat well, the tent was sealed tight, no unusual sounds or movements. But I could feel something building in the atmosphere, a tension that preceded major weather events. Morning brought snow, not the light, dry powder that had fallen in November, but heavier flakes that accumulated quickly. By the time I had my morning fire going and water melting for coffee, 3 inches had fallen and the rate was increasing. The temperature held just below zero, cold enough that the snow was dry rather than wet, but not so cold that it stopped falling. This was the dangerous range for snow accumulation. Wet snow was heavy, but usually came with warmer temperatures that limited how much fell. Very cold snow was light, but often came with wind that prevented heavy accumulation. This middle range produced steady, deep snowfall that could bury structures. I spent the morning reinforcing my tent's guy lines and stakes, adding redundancy to every critical attachment point. The snow continued falling steadily, accumulating at a rate of about an inch per hour. By noon, 8 inches covered the ground, and the weight of snow on my tent's steep walls was beginning to test the structure. But the steep angle worked as designed. Every few hours, accumulated snow would slide off in sheets, hitting the ground with soft thumps. The wall tents, with their gentler slopes, weren't shedding snow as effectively. I could see them sagging under the weight, their occupants having to go outside periodically to push snow off the canvas. Anders Lindstrom appeared through the falling snow around 2 in the afternoon. He looked grim. "Wind is coming," he said. "How do you know?" "The snow changed. See how the flakes are smaller now and falling faster, but in patterns? This means wind aloft, not yet reaching the ground, but coming down." I looked at the snowfall more carefully. He was right. The flakes had changed character, becoming smaller and more uniform, falling in subtle swirls rather than straight down. These were signs I'd learned to recognize in Norway, indicators that wind patterns were shifting. "How long?" I asked. "Hours, maybe less. When it arrives, it will be strong." "How strong?" Lindstrom shook his head. "Don't know, but strong enough to worry about." He helped me add additional stakes and guy lines to my tent, driving them into the snow-covered ground at angles that would resist lifting forces. We worked quickly and efficiently, not talking, just focusing on the task. When we finished, my tent had twice as many attachment points as it had started with, redundancy built into every system. "Your tent is small," Lindstrom said when we were done, "but it is built like a fortress. If mine fails, I come here. If mine fails, we're both in trouble." The wind arrived at dusk. It started as a low moan in the valley, a sound that built gradually from distant to immediate. Within minutes, it went from calm to gale force, hitting perhaps 40 miles per hour in the initial gusts. The effect on the camp was immediate and dramatic. The wall tents, with their vertical surfaces and accumulated snow loads, began struggling. Canvas popped and snapped. Guy lines went taut, stakes pulled partially out of the ground. Men scrambled to reinforce their shelters in the growing dark, fighting wind and snow while trying to prevent catastrophic failures. My tent shuddered but held. The steep walls deflected the wind up and over rather than catching it directly. The narrow profile gave wind less surface area to push against. The snow that had accumulated before the wind arrived had already slid off, meaning there was minimal weight pressing down from above. Inside, the sound was constant and loud, canvas vibrating, wind screaming, snow hitting the fabric like thrown sand. But the structure remained solid. The guy lines I'd reinforced that afternoon held firm. The stakes, driven at multiple angles, distributed the forces. The earth banking prevented wind from getting underneath the canvas edge. I fed the stove carefully, maintaining steady heat without letting the fire get too hot. In high wind, excessive heat could create pressure. differentials that would stress the tent fabric. Moderate, steady warmth was safer. The wind increased through the evening, and with it came a temperature drop. By midnight, it was 15 below zero, with winds I estimated at 60 miles per hour. The combination, cold and wind, created conditions more dangerous than either alone. Wind chill dropped the effective temperature to 40 or 50 below, cold enough to cause frostbite and expose skin within minutes. Through the tent walls I could hear chaos in the camp, shouts. The sound of canvas tearing, crashes as structures failed. I wanted to help, but venturing outside in these conditions would be suicidal. The best thing I could do was maintain my own shelter and be ready to take in anyone who made it to my tent. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a different sound, someone calling my name. I opened the entrance flap carefully, preventing snow and wind from flooding in. Bill Hendricks stood outside, barely visible through the blowing snow, his face covered in ice. "My tent's gone," he shouted over the wind. "Took 2 others with it. We need shelter." "How many?" 6 of us. 6 men in a tent designed for 1. It would be cramped beyond belief, but possible. Better than freezing outside. "Come on," I shouted back. They came through the entrance, one at a time, snow-covered and half-frozen. Hendricks, Thomas Riley, McGregor, and 3 others I knew only by sight. They brought nothing but themselves and the clothes they wore. Everything else had been lost when their tents failed. Inside, we packed together like cargo. 4 men sat against one wall, 3 against the other, knees overlapping, sharing body heat. The tent that had felt spacious for 1 person became claustrophobic with 7, but it held. The centered stove kept working, the ventilation system prevented suffocation, the structure remained sound. We took turns managing the stove through the night. 1 man awake at all times, feeding small pieces of wood, maintaining steady heat without wasting fuel. The others tried to sleep, sitting up, bodies pressed together, sharing warmth. The wind continued unabated. If anything, it grew stronger through the night, reaching what I estimated were gusts of 70 or 80 miles per hour. At these speeds, the wind became a physical force that you could feel through the tent walls, a pressure that tested every stake and guy line. Around 3 in the morning, we heard a massive crack, followed by prolonged crashing sounds. Another tent had failed. Through our canvas walls, we heard men shouting, scrambling for shelter. I couldn't tell which tent had gone down or how many men needed help, but there was nothing we could do. 7 men in my tent was already pushing the absolute limit. 8 or 9 would create too much moisture from breathing, would warm the air enough that condensation would soak everything, would consume our limited oxygen too quickly. Bill Hendricks, sitting next to me, understood this calculation. "Can't save everyone," he said quietly. "No. Your tent's the only thing standing that I can hear, the only thing not making destruction noises. Lindstrom's tent might be holding, maybe 1 or 2 others. Maybe. Christ, this wind. Never seen anything like it." Thomas Riley, across from us, spoke up. "I've seen wind like this once. Montana Territory, 1878. Killed 6 people in 1 night. Tore apart buildings that had stood for 20 years. This is the same kind of wind." "How long did it last?" someone asked. 3 days. The tent went quiet. 3 days of this would test everything. Our firewood supplies, our sanity, our shelter's durability. 3 days of 7 men packed into a space meant for 1. "We'll manage," I said. "We've got enough wood stacked outside and the tent's holding fine. Just need to stay calm and work together." "You built this." "Tent yourself?" McGregor asked. "The design, I mean?" "Based on principles I learned in Norway. Nothing original, just old knowledge applied to these conditions." "Well, whoever figured it out first knew what they were doing. This tent's saving our lives right now." Around 4 in the morning, the wind reached its peak intensity. The sound became constant, no longer individual gusts, but a sustained roar that made conversation nearly impossible. The tent walls vibrated so fast they became almost rigid, the canvas pulled drum-tight by the wind pressure and the guy lines holding against it. I watched the ridgepole carefully, looking for any signs of stress or failure. It flexed slightly with each major gust, but always returned to its original position. The spruce wood had some give to it, which was good. Rigid materials would snap under this stress, but flexible materials could absorb and distribute the forces. The stakes were the critical vulnerability. If enough stakes pulled out, the tent would lose structural integrity and collapse. But the stakes I'd driven at angles, the redundant guy lines, the earth banking, all of it worked together to distribute the load across multiple points. No single failure would doom the structure. Dawn came gray and violent. Through the entrance flap, visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Snow blew horizontal, accumulating in drifts that buried anything not elevated. The temperature had dropped further. I estimated 25 below, maybe 30, which combined with the wind created effective temperatures of 60 or 70 below zero. No one goes outside unless absolutely necessary, I said. In these conditions, you'd die in minutes. We rationed our water carefully through the morning. 7 men generated a lot of metabolic heat and a lot of moisture through breathing. We needed to drink to stay hydrated, but every pot of melted snow we consumed meant burning wood and adding humidity to the tent interior. The balance was delicate. By mid-morning, condensation was forming on the tent walls despite the ventilation flaps being open. The moisture froze immediately into frost, which was actually helpful. Better to have moisture frozen on the canvas than dripping onto us or soaking into our clothing. Around noon, we heard someone outside shouting to be let in. Hendricks and I worked together to open the entrance flap without losing too much heat or letting snow blow in. Anders Lindstrom pushed through, covered in ice, moving stiffly. "My tent held," he said once he was inside, "but 2 more men there, and I can't keep stove going with the wind, kept blowing out. Better to have everyone in one place." 8 men now. The tent was packed beyond any reasonable capacity. We couldn't all sit with our legs extended. Half of us had to keep our knees bent, feet pulled in. But we were alive and relatively warm, and that was what mattered. Lindstrom had brought news from around the camp. 7 tents. "Down completely," he reported. 3 more damaged but standing. Maybe 15 men total need shelter. Some went to the supply cache building, but it's not warm. Just wind protection. "How many died?" Riley asked. "Don't know. Haven't seen everyone. When the wind stops, we'll know." The afternoon was a test of patience and endurance. 8 men in a space meant for one, unable to move freely, sharing air and heat and limited water. Tempers could have flared, but everyone understood that cooperation was survival. We took turns at the stove, took turns sleeping, took turns monitoring the tent's condition. The wind died suddenly around midnight, dropping from sustained gale force to calm in less than an hour. The silence after all that noise was disorienting, almost eerie. We'd grown so accustomed to the constant roar that its absence felt wrong. I was the first one out of the tent at dawn. The scene that greeted me was devastation. The camp I'd arrived at 3 months earlier had been transformed into a wreckage of torn canvas, broken poles, scattered equipment, and snowdrifts that buried everything to unrecognizable shapes. Of the 15 tents that had stood before the blizzard, only 4 remained upright. Mine, Lindstrom's, and 2 others that I could see through the clearing air. 7 tents were completely destroyed, nothing left but shredded canvas and snapped poles. 4 more were collapsed but potentially salvageable, their canvas torn, but their structures partially intact. Men emerged from the surviving shelters and from the supply cache building, moving slowly, checking on each other, assessing the damage. The first priority was accounting for everyone. 15 prospectors had been in camp when the storm hit. We counted 14 moving around in the aftermath. The missing man was found an hour later, frozen solid 20 yards from where his tent had been. He'd tried to reach the supply cache after his tent failed, but the wind and cold had overcome him. His body was buried in a drift, visible only because one arm extended above the snow. His name was Patrick Carroll, an Irishman from Boston who'd come north the same time I had. We'd spoken a few times but never became close. Now he was dead, killed by a storm he hadn't adequately prepared for, in a shelter that had seemed adequate until it wasn't. We buried him as best we could. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, so we laid him in a natural depression and covered him with stones from the creek. Someone said a prayer. Someone else said a few words about him being a good man who'd had bad luck. Then we went back to the work of survival. 13 men needed immediate shelter, the ones whose tents had been destroyed or badly damaged. My tent had proven it could hold 8 men for one night, but sustaining that many long-term was impossible. We needed a better solution. The supply cache building became the temporary answer. It was a log structure, 20 feet by 30 feet, built for storing equipment and supplies, rather than housing people. It had a dirt floor, no stove, and gaps between the logs, but it was standing and it provided wind protection. We moved men there, 8 of them, and built a fire in the center of the dirt floor. Not ideal, but functional. Smoke escaped through the gaps in the logs and through a hole we cut in the roof. The building wouldn't be warm, but it would be warmer than outside. The other 5 men, the ones whose tents were damaged but potentially repairable, worked on salvage operations. Canvas could be patched if you had material. Poles could be replaced if you had wood. Stakes could be replaced. Guy lines could be spliced. It would take days, but functional shelters could be rebuilt. Bill Hendricks came to me as I was reinforcing my tent after the night of overcrowding. He looked exhausted, but thoughtful. "Your tent saved 8 lives last night," he said. "The tent didn't save anyone. Physics saved them. The tent just applied physics correctly. Still, most of us would be dead if you hadn't built the way you did." "Or if Lindstrom hadn't copied the design," I said. "His tent held too?" "Because he learned from watching you." I didn't have a good response to that, so I kept working on retying guy lines that had loosened during the night. "Thing is," Hendricks continued, "I'm rebuilding my tent. We all are, those of us who lost them. And I'm going to rebuild it different. Smaller, steeper, dug in. The way you built yours, if you'll share the details." "Nothing secret about it. Happy to explain anything you want to." "No." Over the next 2 days, as the camp recovered from the blizzard, I spent hours explaining tent design principles to anyone who asked. The steep walls that shed snow and deflected wind, the earth banking that prevented air infiltration, the centered stove that radiated heat efficiently, the raised floor that trapped cold air below the sleeping level, the angled stovepipe that maximized heat transfer before exhausting. None of these ideas were mine originally. They were all borrowed from men like Lars who'd figured them out through generations of trial and error. But they were new to the Yukon prospectors, and they were proven now by the storm's results. By late December, the camp had been rebuilt. Not restored to its original configuration, but rebuilt using different principles. 6 of the new tents were narrow wedge designs, similar to mine. 3 were modified wall tents with steeper roofs and earth banking. 2 men left entirely, heading downriver to 40 Mile Town, deciding they'd had enough of winter camping. The changes weren't dramatic from a distance. The camp still looked like a mining camp, tents scattered along the creek, smoke rising from stoves. But the details were different. The angles of the tent walls, the way they sat lower to the ground, the banking around their bases, the way stovepipes angled rather than rising straight up. These changes had cost men time and effort during the busiest part of winter preparation, but no one complained. They'd seen what worked and what failed during the blizzard. The evidence had been absolute and undeniable. Build right and you survive. Build wrong and you die or depend on others to save you. Anders Lindstrom spent an evening at my tent in early January, sitting by the stove, drinking coffee I'd made from melted snow and hoarded beans. He'd helped 3 men rebuild their tents, teaching them the same principles I'd taught him, spreading the knowledge through the camp. "You know what is interesting?" he said. "Before the storm, you were the fool with the strange tent. After the storm, you are the expert. Everyone asks questions. Same tent, same knowledge, but different perception. People learn better from experience than from explanation," I said. "Yes, but it is unfortunate that experience must be so harsh. Patrick Carroll, he learned nothing because he is dead. The rest of us, we learned because we survived. But we only survived because some of us, you, and then me, and then a few others, we built for the worst case instead of the average case." My Uncle Lars would say that's the only rational approach. Prepare for the worst you can imagine, because the worst you've seen is never the worst that can happen. Lindstrom nodded slowly. This is wisdom, hard wisdom, but true wisdom. The rest of January and all of February brought cold that tested our shelters repeatedly. Temperatures dropped to 40 below for days at a stretch. Wind returned, though never as violent as the blizzard. Snow accumulated to depths that buried anything not actively maintained. But no more tents failed. No more men died from exposure. The camp had learned what it needed to learn, paid the price it needed to pay, and emerged stronger for it. I spent the winter months working my claim when weather permitted, staying inside my tent when it didn't. The narrow space that had seemed inadequate in September now felt exactly right, small enough to heat efficiently, large enough to live in comfortably, perfectly suited to its environment. In March, when the worst of winter had passed and the days began lengthening noticeably, Bill Hendricks organized a camp meeting. 15 men gathered, 14 who'd survived the blizzard plus one who'd arrived late in December and missed it. "Wanted to say something while we're all together," Hendricks began. "This was a hard winter. We lost Patrick, and we almost lost more. But we learned things that will keep us safer next winter and the winters after that." He gestured toward my tent. "Some of us learned by watching, some learned by copying, some learned by having our own tents fail and needing shelter in someone else's. But we all learned that preparation matters more than luck, and that building right matters more than building fast." There was general agreement, men nodding, a few murmured comments. So I wanted to thank the man who taught us these lessons, even when we were mocking him for it, because his stubborn insistence on doing things his own way saved lives when the storm came. The men looked at me. I didn't know what to say. I'd just built a tent the way Lars had taught me to build. Nothing heroic, nothing special, just applied knowledge from one mountain range to another. "I wasn't trying to teach anyone," I finally said. "I was trying to survive. If my tent had failed, I would have been the fool everyone said I was. It didn't fail because it was built on principles that had been tested and proven long before I was born. I deserve no credit except for listening to my uncle and trusting his knowledge over my own inexperience." "Still," Hendricks said, "whether you meant to teach or not, we learned, and that matters." The meeting dispersed after a while, men returning to their own shelters and their own work. But something had changed in the camp's social dynamics. I was no longer the outsider with strange ideas. I'd become part of the community, my knowledge valued, my opinions sought. This was how survival knowledge actually spread through isolated populations. Not through books or formal education, but through observation, adoption, crisis, and validation. Someone tried something different. Others mocked it until crisis proved it superior. Then everyone adopted it, and it became the new standard practice, eventually forgetting that it had once been considered strange. By April, when the ice on the 40-mile river began breaking up and the first boats arrived with fresh supplies and news from outside, the camp's tents looked fundamentally different from how they'd looked in September. The changes weren't obvious to the newcomers. They were just tents, after all. But to those of us who'd survived the winter, every angle and every design choice carried meaning. We'd learned that survival often depended on decisions made long before crisis arrived. That mockery was easier than understanding. That tradition wasn't always wisdom, and innovation wasn't always foolishness. That the difference between adequate and excessive preparation revealed itself only when conditions exceeded previous experience. These were lessons learned in cold and wind and fear, lessons validated by survival and by death. They were expensive lessons, but permanent ones, the kind that shaped how men thought about shelter and safety for the rest of their lives. Patrick Carroll's stone cairn stood at the edge of camp, a reminder of what happened when preparation met conditions slightly worse than expected. We'd marked it carefully so it wouldn't be forgotten when snow melted and new prospectors arrived. His death had taught us as much as our survival had, maybe more. The fool's tent, the skinny grave marker, the shelter everyone had mocked, it had stood when others fell. Not because I was smarter or braver or more capable than the men whose tents had failed, but because I'd learned from someone who'd learned from someone else across generations, through winters that killed the unprepared and spared those who understood that physics didn't care about opinions. That understanding, earned through cold and validated through storm, was the real shelter. The tent was just canvas and poles. The knowledge was what kept you alive.